It's time to begin the award ceremony. I want to cut right to the chase. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing the first awardee this evening, Frank Gaffney. The truth is that we contemplating having someone of greater stature than I introducing Frank. But at the end of the day, I used my privilege as the co-founder of the organization to say nobody but I shall do so. Frank Gaffney, we all know, is the president and founder of the Center for Security Policy, an organization that has been around for decades, literally from the day after, or almost literally from the day after he left the Reagan administration, where he served President Reagan as Assistant Secretary of Defense, served in important positions there, and of course, prior to that, was senior aide to someone that, at least of our generation, holds a very special place, Henry Scoop Jackson. Frank is more than just the president of the Center for Security Policy to me. First of all, he is a client. No, a non-paying client. I serve as general counsel to the Center for Security Policy, a position that I place on my resume with incredible humility and honor. But most importantly, Frank occupies the dual position to me as friend and mentor. When we began to contemplate establishing the American Freedom Law Center 4 years ago, the key issue was what kind of organization the typical public interest law firm with dozens of lawyers and fancy offices and a constant gin machine to create funds for running the organization, or did two individual lawyers create an organization that would operate lean and mean, and as Frank says, with the emphasis on mean, to fight the battles that we had. I looked around, and the Center for Security Policy became my model. It had been around for many more years and certainly has a bigger budget than we have. But Frank always would describe the center, and seeing it from inside, I knew it was true, as the special forces, the strike forces of policy institutes. No big offices, lean budgets, and most importantly, a constant attention to identifying other organizations and assets that he could bring into the battles. There was never a hegemony over fundraising and donations. Frank was always prepared to help another organization if they brought value added. That to me was a key lesson. And of course, when I came to Frank and said, we'd like to establish the American Freedom Law Center, essentially as an adjunct, the legal tip of the spear to the Center for Security Policy. The Center for Security Policy wrote a check for $400,000 as a foundational grant, which enabled us to launch the organization. Without further ado, I'd like to honor Frank Gaffney with the Freedom Fighter Awards.
Well, I don't know if you had the same reaction that I did at the beginning of that very generous introduction where he started talking about how we were trying to find somebody more distinguished. I thought he was talking about me. I feel your pain, David, I have to say. But thank you for this extraordinary honor. I have to say that, if I can keep the mic steady, it's doubly felt because of the friendship and great affection I have for the two principals of this organization. And I want to just take a minute of the time that I have allotted to me to tell you the story about how I met David initially. I think it was Steve Emerson, though he doesn't acknowledge that this was the cause of my meeting David in the first place, but I was told that there was this guy who had been running an undercover investigation of 100 mosques across the United States. And he wanted to meet me. And I said, I want to meet him. So this rather unlikely individual, though I must say, you look pretty darn good in that publicity photograph, David, turns up in my office and we sit down and we have a complete mind meld as he talks about what he had been doing on his own. I mean, he wasn't so much the guy going into the mosques, needless to say, but he had really pulled off this rigorous, empirically driven analysis of 100 mosques randomly selected across the country for the purposes of testing a proposition. And those of you who know David will recognize this is the way his mind works. His proposition, his thesis was that where you found empirically rooted evidence of Sharia being practiced in the given mosque, that if you looked in the right places, you would find evidence of jihad being promoted as well. And sure enough, when they did the analysis, and when I say they did the analysis, I don't mean that they just sort of collected the computations of the guys who went in. I mean that he did this labor of love with one of his colleagues in Israel, published in not one but two different peer-reviewed journals, and established that there was basically a perfect correlation. In the 80% of the mosques where you found Sharia being practiced, you found jihad being promoted. So I thought that was pretty cool. This is my kind of guy. And about an hour had passed, and I guess we were both getting ready to go on to other things. And as he's about to get up, I think maybe actually we had literally both gotten up and we were heading to the door, and he says, oh, by the way, I've been following with interest a little furball we had gotten ourselves into at the time with the public broadcasting service. I don't know how many of this, you may remember this, Colin Hanna will, I'm sure, from days of yore, but we had produced a film with considerable support from you, the taxpayers, for which I'm very grateful, that the public broadcasting system was refusing to air. It was called Islam versus Islamists. It was basically a film about, this phenomenon that we're all told about. Andy McCarthy's done a lot of excellent analysis of this, as of others in the room, that there are lots of moderate Muslims. And the question was, how come we never hear from any of them? Except Zuhdi Jasser. And so we did a film that profiled, actually, Zuhdi Jasser and about 8, I think, other Muslims in various walks of life and nations. And their stories were the thrust of this film. And it turned out that it wasn't all that hard to understand why you didn't hear more from others. They were scared to death. They were scared to death of being ostracized or worse by a community that did not tolerate their kind of Islam. So the film wound up being rather harsh, I think it's fair to say, on those Muslims who were featured as kind of the antagonists, the people who were intimidating or threatening or ostracizing the ones we were profiling. And it turned out that the public broadcasting system, in its wisdom, thought we were being unfair to the Islamists. And they wanted us to sort of beef up their story and downplay a bit those moderates. Well, David said, just kind of out of the blue, because this was at that point pretty ugly and likely to get worse. He said, I used to be an entertainment lawyer for 20th Century Fox, as I recall, and I'd be happy to represent you pro bono. And that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So I just want to say, David, to you and to Rob, who have gone on to lend that pro bono help and expertise to so many of us, both in the offensive and the defensive mode of lawfare, which, by the way, just happens to be the title of Messrs. Yerushalmi and Muse's new monograph, which I'm told Adam Savitt will be out tomorrow at the Center for Security Policy's Civilization Jihad Reader Series. It's about lawfare, how it's practiced against us, and how we need to be practicing it against the Islamic supremacists. So I want to salute you for that very real-time contribution to the war for the free world, and for being such incredibly indefatigable, creative, and impressive freedom fighters in your own right. It's a privilege to be working with you. Thank you for being on our team.